Zechor Yemot Olam Binu Shnot Dor Vador. Almighty God in heaven, thy prophet and lawgiver Moses instructed us, remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. On this evening we thank thee for a university which has launched a program built on the foundations of understanding the days of old, and for a president who has unequivocally spoken about strengthening these bonds of understanding. We thank thee for a philanthropist who has the foresight to foster a greater understanding of the Jewish people and their past. Avinu Shebashamayim, Father in heaven, bless this illustrious institution, Fordham University, to continue pursuing Moses' final instructions. Bless Father Joseph McShane and the leadership of Fordham to continue to be beacons of religious understanding and respect. Bless Mr. Eugene Shvidler and his family to continue to support noble causes. And bless Professor Magda Teter, the inaugural holder of the Shvidler Chair in Judaic Studies, to continue in her important research and scholarship that seeks to better understand the Jewish past and deepen our knowledge of each other. Let us say, Amen.
Amen.
Good evening. It's so wonderful to see such a large group here tonight. I know that Eugene would be very proud. Today is a proud day in our university's history as we celebrate the work and achievements of Dr. Magda Teter as the Shvidler Chair in Judaic Studies. The chair was established by a most generous gift from Eugene Shvidler. We are thrilled and very happy that Eugene's son, Daniel, is here with us this evening as we celebrate this occasion. Daniel, please rise. Eugene's generosity and thoughtfulness in establishing this chair will serve to enhance teachings that focus on Jewish traditions and history. Eugene Shvidler was born in the Soviet Union, and he received a master's degree in mathematics from the Gubkin Institute of Petrochemicals and Natural Gas in Moscow. In 1989, he immigrated to the United States, where he earned 2 degrees here at Fordham University, an MBA and an MS in International Taxation, both from the Gabelli School of Business in 1992. He worked for Deloitte & Touche from 1992 through 1994, and that year he became an American citizen. Eugene went back to Russia and made his fortune in the nation's oil industry, serving as the president of Sibneft from 1998 through 2005. Today, he is the chairman of Millhouse LLC, a privately held asset management company, and he's also the executive chairman of Highland Gold Mining Limited. Together with his wife, Zara, Eugene has been one of the leading funders of several projects that advance Judaic studies around the world. The couple, who have 5 children, provided the primary support needed to build a number of important institutions, including a Jewish primary school in London, now called the Bet Shvidler Primary School, the Bet Shvidler educational complexes in Moscow and Ufa, and the Bet Shvidler Conference Center in Muncie, New York. In addition to these tremendous efforts, Eugene is involved in many projects around the world that focus on the history of Jews in both Russia and in historical Jerusalem. This is the first chair of its kind here at Fordham University and will allow our university to grow in a new direction. The establishment of the Shvidler Chair in Judaic Studies has broadened Fordham's offering in Jewish history and has helped to build Jewish studies as a field of study at Fordham University. It is now my pleasure to introduce and welcome Dr. John Harrington, Associate Vice President and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Stephen. Tonight, we're all thrilled, I think, to honor a new member of the Fordham faculty and a new member of the Fordham community. As the inaugural holder of the Shvidler Chair in Judaic Studies, Dr. Magda Teter will help to guide Fordham with her knowledge and research of Jewish studies and to develop a new field at our university that has not been firmly established until now. A leader in the fields of early modern Polish Jewish history and also of Catholic Jewish relations, Magda comes to Fordham from Wesleyan University, where she specialized in Jewish history and early modern religious and cultural history. Her emphasis has been on Jewish-Christian relations in Eastern Europe, on the politics of religion, and on transmission of culture among Jews and Christians across Europe. She grew up in Cold War Poland and received an MA from the School of Oriental Studies at the University of Warsaw, and an MA, an MPhil, and a PhD from Columbia University. Magda is a recognized scholar and author, having written and edited many books and articles in English, Polish, and Hebrew. All of Fordham is thrilled to celebrate her and her accomplishments tonight as she is installed as the inaugural Shvidler Chair in Jewish Studies.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harrington. Now I'd like to introduce the president of Fordham University, the Reverend Joseph M. McShane of the Society of Jesus.
Thank you very much, Roger. And I want to welcome all of you. At the outset, however, before I say anything about a dear friend, and that is Eugene Shvidler, I want to say something about the context in which we gather and the importance about what we do tonight. We gather this evening at a very sad moment in the history of the human family. As we gather this night, we cannot forget what happened in Paris this past weekend. And because we cannot forget what happened in Paris this past weekend, all of us, I believe, find ourselves wrestling with the question of how something so horrific as what happened in Paris could happen. How could something as horrible as that be justified with a reference to the Almighty? As Pope Francis said over the weekend, it is blasphemy to claim that God would ever desire such horrible things to happen. It is blasphemy to think that we could bless murder by invoking God's name. It is in this context that we gather, and it is this context, I think, that makes clear that what we do this night is important. It's important not only for Fordham, it's important for all of the human family. It's important for the three families that are descended from Abraham. But tonight, we not only inaugurate a chair in Jewish studies and Jewish history. Tonight, we light a light in the world. And we stake a claim. And the claim is this, that here at Fordham, we seek to build bridges. Here at Fordham, we celebrate the human spirit. Here at Fordham, we devote ourselves to showing the world that life, not death, comes from faith in God. This light is very important. It is always important, but it is especially important in the aftermath of what happened in Paris. We at Fordham, as a family, pledge ourselves this day through this inauguration to the work of building peace, of creating bridges of understanding, of cherishing the human spirit. We at Fordham this night unite in prayer for those who died. We at Fordham this night unite in prayer for those who keep faith. We unite in praying for those who mourn. most especially, we unite in our determination not to let violence and death define what the human family is or wants to be about. And I'd ask you, if you don't mind, if we could just pause and pray for all the victims of what happened in Paris, both this past weekend and last year, connected with the Hebdo situation. Let us pray in our hearts for the repose of their souls, the consolation of their families, and the consolation of the human family. Let us pray. Eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. May their souls and the souls of all the faithful departed, for the mercy of God, rest in peace. Amen.
Amen.
And now, my sisters and brothers, the more joyous part of what we do, and joy is the greatest response to violence, I think. This is a joyous moment, a lighting of light. It's a moment that is made possible by the great generosity of a dear friend of ours here at Fordham, Eugene Shvidler, whom I am honored to call a friend. But as I remind him, as wonderful as he is, and he is wonderful, as is the case with many, he married up. Zara is the light of his life. Is that not true, Daniel? And their 5 children light their lives together. Tonight, I say to you all, Eugene is a wonderful man, a man who believes in the power of education, a man who believes in the sanctity of family, a man who has devoted himself to doing good so that mutual understanding might thrive in the place of violent disagreements. It is therefore not at all a surprise that when Roger and I spoke to him about a gift that he might give to Fordham, he was drawn to this, because he believed that research and teaching would enable us to grow as a family. And here in New York, I said to him, Eugene, it is especially important that in New York, the Jesuit University of New York have a chair in Jewish studies, because that would say something. And it does say something, something very important. So this night, in front of all of you, I want publicly, to acknowledge the great goodness of Eugene and Zara first, the goodness of Eugene and Zara. And only after I acknowledge that do I acknowledge the generosity that flows from their goodness, a generosity which will make it possible for us to light lights of understanding and build bridges of affection, and not just of understanding between and among the different families of faith in the world. And I know that I speak for everyone in the university when I say I cannot imagine a better candidate or a better holder of the Shvidler chair than Magda Teter. If you would join me up here, and Stephen, and I want Daniel as well to come up here and join us, and Michael Matlin, if you could, representing Eugene and Zara as well. And I have tasks for all of you to do. Jesuits are very good at giving out tasks. Taking money, but giving out tasks. I'm going to ask you, if you would, at the appropriate moment, put that on Magda. Michael, I'm going to ask you if you could present that to Magda at the appropriate moment. And you will ask, what is the appropriate moment? I'll tell you. And then, Daniel, I'm going to ask you to accept on behalf of your family this. All right? So in the order of things, the first thing I want to do, and I'd ask you to join with me in acknowledging Eugene and Zara and their family. The first thing I want to do is, on behalf of the university, I entrust this to you, my dear friend, Daniel.
Thank you.
Make sure that your father picks it up when he comes to visit you, to make sure that your allowance is paid and that you are well fed. All right, you will do all of that for me? Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And now, you're next up, but wait till I tell you when. All right? And then, Michael, you are last. But as we know from Scripture, the last shall be first. In recognition of your thoughtful and groundbreaking scholarship and service within your field, and on behalf of the human family, Fordham University is proud and delighted to welcome Dr. Magda Teter to the Shvidler Chair in Judaic Studies. Magda, this night we present you with this medal to acknowledge your position as a most accomplished researcher, educator, and mentor, and to signify your special place within the Fordham educational community. Dr. Friedman, if you would be so kind as to invest Dr. Teter, this will mark her entrance into our faculty at an exalted level, that of an endowed professor here at Fordham. Ladies and gentlemen. And that I can ask Dr. Michael Matlin if he could present Magda with this plaque, which acknowledges her in a special way and also spells out for all who will enter your office from now on all the things that you have accomplished. And I say on behalf of everyone at Fordham, as wonderful as that record is, may it pale in comparison to all that you will do now as the Shvidler Chair of Judaic Studies. And now, my friends, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Mr. Michael Matlin, who is the Managing Director of Concord Management and a dear friend of Eugene Shvidler, to say a few words on behalf of Eugene and Zara Shvidler and their family. Michael.
Unfortunately, Eugene Shvidler was not able to join us, so he asked me to say a few words in honor of tonight's event. First of all, I would like to thank the administration and the faculty of Fordham University for their vision, perseverance, hard work, and even courage to establish the Chair of Jewish Studies here. I think that Fordham is somewhat different than many other universities. If you look at the motto or emblem of Fordham, you could see the two words written there, Sapientia et Doctrina. You could see it right on this flag and on the emblem, maybe here and other places. Sapientia et Doctrina. These words could be found in Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 2, verse 21, and in Hebrew, these words are read Chochma v'Da'at, which means wisdom and knowledge. If one were to identify these words as an abbreviated mission statement of Fordham University, one may interpret that not only is it important to teach the student knowledge and skills, but also it is essential to develop wisdom to help find meaning or purpose. Many fine institutions of the modern world may excel in affording their students with a top-notch education, but how many of those can provide meaning? Science tells us how, but not why. Technology gives us tremendous power, but cannot guide us as to how to channel that power. The market gives us an abundance of choices, but does not instruct us how to make those choices. The liberal democratic state gives us the freedom to live as we choose, but refuses on principle, thankfully, to guide us on how to choose.
When I arrived from Poland at Columbia University to begin a PhD program in Jewish history, Professor Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, Zichrono Livracha, greeted me and gave me a copy of his book Zachor, which in Hebrew means remember, inscribing in it in Hebrew, Le Magda Behatzlacha, to Magda, good luck. And though I was already fortunate attending one of the most distinguished programs in Jewish history, Professors Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi and Michael Stanislavski took a leap of faith, admitting a Polish student who has just gotten her MA degree in Warsaw with a thesis on the Mongolian translation of the Hebrew Bible. I very much needed the good wishes Professor Yerushalmi inscribed in this book for me. Back then, though, I could not have imagined the honor I would be receiving today, so thank you. As one of the most important aspects of my Columbia education in Jewish history was an approach to Jewish history that saw it as part of larger historical context. Nowhere and never have the Jews lived in isolation. Everywhere and throughout history, they lived among other peoples and cultures. Jewish culture thus developed in conversation, if sometimes polemical, with their neighbors, and the neighbors' culture similarly developed in conversation with Jews. I gave the title of this talk From Alienation to Integration, and for anyone familiar with Jewish history, these terms usually signal a trajectory of Jews as an alienated minority in the pre-modern period who became integrated into the larger society in modernity. But today, I would like to make a case for rethinking of this version of Jewish history, and with it also for rethinking our concepts of both modernity and the pre-modern era. Until the Polish-born scholar Salo Baron was appointed the Nathan L. Miller Chair in Jewish History and Culture at my alma mater, Columbia University, in 1930, Jewish history and culture had not been taught at secular non-Jewish institutions. Scholars of Jewish history before Baron either held positions at Jewish institutions of higher learning or were, as we would call them today, independent scholars. Just as they and Jewish history were excluded from non-Jewish institutions of higher learning, so too were they presenting a version of Jewish history as separate from other histories. Learning and suffering, as the renowned German Jewish historian has put it, became the mark of Jewish history for many decades. And plenty of learning and suffering was part of Jewish history. But that was not all. But that these 19th century Jewish scholars offered this separated vision of Jewish history is not surprising. At that time, history was at the service of newly emerging national identities and ideologies, and in German, Polish, and other national histories, Jews had little place. Indeed, this modern historiographic framework effectively excluded Jews as foreign and thus peripheral to the national narratives, and resulted in confining them and Jewish history to Jewish scholars writing for Jewish readers. This exclusion of Jews in modern historiography was not just rooted in modern nationalism. The theological concept of Jewish exile, accepted by both Jews and Christians, also played a crucial role. And even if Jews and Christians assigned a different meaning to the Jewish exile, the idea of exile implied that Jews were sojourners wherever they lived. This highly theological view of Jewish exile was then internalized by modern historians who continued to perceive Jews as foreigners in the lands where they had lived for centuries and excluded them from the histories of their modern states. In modern Jewish historiography, the narrative of Jewish social isolation in the pre-modern period was by and large a product of German Jewish history and historiography. German Jewish historians of the 19th century presented Jews, as did, for instance, Markus Jost and Heinrich Gretz, as slaves, striving from lowliness and contempt to greatness and self-consciousness. Seeing Jews as lowly and downtrodden was not just a modern projection of the old notion of the exile onto Jewish history, it also represented the espousal, conscious or not, of ideas developed by early modern German Protestant scholars who perceived Jews as, quote, the poorest of the poor and as a social problem. That was also a quote. Language was at the center of the modern narrative of Jewish, especially Ashkenazi Jewish, social isolation in Christian Europe. Jews were said to speak a jargon, and contrary to historical record, not to know local vernaculars. This perception, too, was a product of early modern German Christians who studied Jewish books in Judeo-German and began to see it as, quote, mixed, confused, and impure kind of German. And even though at the time there was, of course, no pure German, the Christian scholars' study and critique of the Jewish vernacular and concern with purifying the Jewish dialect indirectly helped them define what Jewish language was, what German language was or was not, and create an idea of Germanness that excluded Jews, but to which, paradoxically, German Jews would later strive. By the late 18th century, the early modern Christian attitudes towards Jews and their Jewish vernacular also influenced German Jewish attitudes toward this language and its speakers. Jews speaking Yiddish, which was called a shameful jargon, came to be seen as backward and alien. As a result, modern Jewish scholars wrote about the need of Jews, European Jews at that, to become westernized and even Europeanized by giving up their jargon and adopting local non-Jewish vernaculars. Shaped largely by German Jewish history and historiography, these concepts and approaches to modernity emphasized modern Jewish integration and acculturation, and contributed to the creation of a sense that in pre-modern Europe, Jews were a separate, even alien minority, marginal enough as not to be included what is called general histories. And the same can be said about the narrative of secularization that focused on the dissolution of traditional life conditions and the dissolution of Jewish autonomy. And if the social and legal position of the Jews in German land had, to some extent, helped color this very problematic reading of the broader Jewish past, such legal and social position was not shared by all Jews in pre-modern Christian Europe. Indeed, in early modern Poland, for example, where the largest Yiddish-speaking community lived, though they also spoke Slavic vernacular, no similar attitudes to Jews developed. For one thing, early modern Polish Catholics did not feel the need to learn Hebrew or Yiddish. And if they did, they probably would not see Yiddish as a corrupt German. For another, the social position of the Jews in early modern Poland was much higher. Unlike in German lands, where Jews and Judeo-German came to be compared and sometimes associated with the criminal underclass, in early modern Poland, Jews were mostly attacked for their high social positions, power, and economic activity. If perhaps Jews of German lands could be portrayed as alien and foreign, and I don't agree with that, because of their legal status and economic marginalization, that sometimes set them apart from Christians. In Poland, and even more in Italy, this was much harder to do. In Poland, Jews were much more integrated into the broader society, economically, politically, and socially. And in Italy, also culturally, despite living in the ghettos. And yet, even in German lands, despite the Jews' perceived alienness, as scholars have recently shown, Jews were very much part of the society, frequently interacting and establishing relationships with their non-Jewish neighbors. Examining the Jewish experience in the early modern period on its own terms, without projecting our modern ideas onto the pre-modern period, or in the words of a historian, Karol Symes, without subordinating the pre-modern period to modernity and without doing epistemic violence to the period, we may thus help not only help refine our understanding of pre-modern European history in general and Jewish society in particular, but also our understanding of the modern period and modernity itself. Indeed, the oft-quoted attributes of modernity, especially Jewish modernity, like the ostensible dismantling of Jewish autonomy, Jewish integration into non-Jewish society, and here quotes from scholarly works, freedom from religious controls, enjoyment of pleasures of this world at the expense of ignoring religious norms and the supervision of rabbinic elites, were not necessarily signs of modernity. They very much existed in pre-modern era. If modernization was, as scholars have argued, indeed concomitant or effect of integration, or if Jewish integration, as some scholars have argued, was a basic criterion of the modern period, then questions have to be raised about what is meant by integration. Since social, economic, and I would even venture to say political integration may well have been in place before modernity. One of the first scholars to begin raise serious questions about this division was Salo Baron. Not only did he challenge the so-called lachrymose theory of pre-revolutionary woe in Jewish history that overemphasized the pre-modern suffering while idealizing modern glory, but he also stressed that Jewish history was dependent on external developments, and as such, general history had to be integrated into Jewish history. But Baron did not go far enough. If understanding the general context in order to understand the Jewish experience itself is or should be a given, examination of Jewish and Christian sources side by side reveals the interdependence of Jewish and non-Jewish societies and cultures. Paying attention to Jews in European society can in fact also help us understand, refine, and even revise the history of the societies and states of which Jews were a part, and even of religious institutions such as the Catholic Church. For in European history, at least, Jews were an integral part of the society and culture. It may be true that modernity is marked by the self-consciousness of social integration, ideological identification of actions that were already in place with social change, but it does not mean that the phenomena marked as signifiers as modernity were new in the modern period, or that they foreshadowed modernity in the early modern period. If Jews were, as I would argue, integrated into European society, culture, economy, politics, can historians really justify disregarding them and confining them to Jewish history? Must we not make Jewish history part of the general history we teach? One of the reasons that scholars are able to revise the older version of history is the use of archives, which preserve sources documenting the intricate complexity of Jewish history and have allowed us to reread traditional Jewish sources in a new light. For the area of my specialization, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which covered today's Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, parts of Latvia, Belarus, Ukraine, and even parts of Moldova. For example, the newly uncovered archival materials related to the activities of the Council of Four Lands, the quintessential Jewish self-government in the pre-modern era in Poland, demonstrate a considerable integration of Jews into Polish political structures. Not only do these documents illustrate the complex fiscal issues related to the position of Jews in Poland, but also the level of involvement of non-Jewish authorities in Jewish communal affairs, sometimes at the behest of Jews themselves. Most evidently, the language used to describe Jewish communal organization demonstrates its total integration into state structures in Poland. The Council of Four Lands, known in Jewish historiography as the Va'ad Arba Aratzot, was called a Seim. Seim is the very same word used for the Diet of the Polish noble, the Polish legislative body. The documents also referred to its leaders by the term corresponding to the Polish official positions. There was a marszałek, or the speaker at its head, exactly the same word used to describe the speaker of the noble Sejm. And the delegate's order was akin to those from local nobles' dietines. The sources in Polish and Latin and in Hebrew undermine the older version of Jewish autonomy in pre-modern Poland that sought to contrast the pre-modern Jewish autonomy to the supposed breakup of the Jewish community in the modern era, during which the states became more interested in the internal workings of the Jewish community. Indeed, the newly discovered and now published documents show the Polish authorities intervening at the behest of Jews, affirming and revoking the authority of rabbis, urging Jews to respect the existing internal communal structures and administrative divisions, and to obey the decisions of Jewish community leaders. Some documents illustrate the presence of the representatives of Polish authorities in the meetings of the council. Let me give you a couple of examples. In 1746, for example, Jan Tarło, the Palatine of Sandomierz, approved one David Szmelka to a position of the rabbi of the Krakow-Sandomierz region. The previous rabbi, Józef Icko-Janowicz, was ousted because of the protests from Jewish lay leaders for his failure to administer justice. And a few years later, in 1753, Karol Sielnicki, the treasurer of the crown, appointed one Abraham Chajmowicz, quote, a merchant from Lublin, as the marszałek, or the speaker of the crown Jews. If these documents undermine the notion of Jewish autonomy, they underscore the integration of Jews into the legal and political structures of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The fact that Christian officials intervened in the appointment of community rabbis and participated in the council's meetings should not be seen necessarily as an infringement on Jewish autonomy, but rather, I would argue, as an indication that the council and the rabbis were seen as performing roles crucial to the proper functioning of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. How much the council was part of the state structures can be evidenced not only by the names of its officers, but also by the composition of the Ve'ad, which resembled the composition and order of the senators of the noble Sejm, with the community of Krakow at its head, followed by Poznań and then other communities. That the Council of Four Lands was intrinsically Polish is, of course, not a new claim. But idealized and glorified, the council, along with its Lithuanian counterpart, had been embraced in the early 20th century by both Zionist and diaspora-centered historians as evidence of Jewish political autonomy, the quintessential body of Jewish self-government. And that idealized image fit into then dominant notion that the Jews in the pre-modern times were isolated, struggling, refusing to integrate into broader society that had rejected them, and created internally sophisticated system of self-governance. Understanding the workings of the Jewish community in its proper historical context may also help us understand the workings of the larger political structures of a pre-modern state. This is done for Poland, the medieval Fatimid state, and even the early modern Spanish Empire, where since 1492, Jews were technically not allowed to live. Yet, recently, historian Flora Kassan has shown that paying attention to the tiny Jewish community of Milan under Spanish rule and the story of their expulsion in 1597 reveals the limits of Spanish imperial powers in acquired territories and the tensions between local authorities and the empire. The story Kassan has told exposed tensions between the papal power and its Jewry policies on the Italian peninsula and those in the Spanish Empire, and revealed complex relationships of the Spanish crown with real Jews. Jewish and non-Jewish histories are connected and overlapping. One cannot be fully understood without the other. Even in places where Jews were not allowed to live, they were part of the history, be it the Spanish Empire or the city of Strasbourg, from which Jews were expelled in the medieval period. There, for example, Jews were very much present. Their presence changed the dynamic between competing Christian authorities, Catholic and Protestant, who had to put aside their political and religious disagreements and cooperate together in making policy concerning the Jews. Similarly, in Poland, inserting Jews into a traditional Polish narrative of post-Reformation history that has been grounded in the Catholic-Protestant dichotomy and presented Catholicism as triumphant, broadened the context of Poland's religious history and exposed the superficiality of the recatholicization of the ruling elites, whose economic interests triumphed over their religious loyalties, and exposed the church as beleaguered, not triumphant, as it faced challenges not only from Protestants, but also from disobedient Catholics and the Jews and their Christian allies. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Jews were the engines of Polish economy, and as we have seen, developed political structures that were not only modeled on, but were integrated into the political structures of the Commonwealth. Historian Gershon Hundert famously challenged the very notion of Jews as a minority in Poland, and provocatively spoke of Jews as and other Poles. Moshe Rosman too demonstrated the deep involvement of Jews in the nobles' estates, and by studying Jews, he has shown that the economy of Polish nobles' estate has been vastly misunderstood by Polish historians who had paid little attention to Jews. To be sure, Jews were Jews, with strong Jewish identities and a separate legal status, and my argument about integration should not be mistaken for assimilation, but they did achieve economic and social integration. They engaged in crafts complementary to those dominated by Christians. They lived right on market squares, not necessarily in separate Jewish streets. They played an important role in exporting grains and processing it for liquor and beer, and then sold it in taverns then ran. And taverns, long before European coffee houses, provided a range of economic and social services to the local population, and first and foremost, a place of recreation where locals, Jews and Christians, would sit, drink, talk, argue, and sing. The centrality of the Jews to the economy of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth can be further attested by the fact that the Catholic clergy, despite prohibitions within church law, welcomed Jews into their possessions and engaged in business relationships with them, causing outrage among higher church officials. In 1749, one parish priest in a small town in Poland was punished by the Episcopal Court for not expelling a Jewish leaseholder of a brewery in a village belonging to the church, despite previous orders to do so. Another example shows a Jew from a town near Krakow who had a lease of a brewery in a nearby village that belonged to the Cistercian monastery, and was admonished by the bishop's decree not to take up leases of ecclesiastical properties or anything prohibited by canon law in the future, under the penalty of arrest. I can multiply examples. The prominent role Jews played in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth led Pope Benedict XIV to issue his encyclical A Quo Primum in 1751, condemning their economic position and close Jewish-Christian relations. But the condemnations demonstrate that Jews were not marginal, but important. They were important players in the country's economy. Nor were they, at least in Poland, a powerless minority. To be sure, access to power did not mean that Jews were secure and unharmed. archival sources dominate that Jews were vulnerable to persecution. Still, despite the persecution, the Jews' legal status allowed them to trigger a mechanism of support that ordinary Christians didn't have. They were able to muster support, reach to the highest echelons of power, kings, bishops, and even popes at times, incidents against Jews, as it happened in the aftermath of a host desecration trial in 1640, triggered new legislation defining power structures in the Commonwealth. Jews were part of a complex legal and political structure, and not just in Poland. Jewish-Christian interactions in the pre-modern era, a period of ostensible isolation and religious and social animosities, have typically been portrayed as instrumental, grounded in economic exchange. This was not necessarily the case. But even in the context of economic exchange, there were venues for contact, conversations, and also intimacy, as Jews and Christians shared carriages, traveling from town to town, or as they shared lodging or enjoyed a drink in an inn. There is no doubt that there was pleasure in these interactions. The enjoyment of the pleasures of this world at the expense of ignoring religious norms and supervision of rabbinic elites were, as I said at the beginning, not necessarily signs of modernity. They were very much existed in the pre-modern era. Eating and drinking in taverns or private homes of non-Jews were prohibited by rabbis and church authorities alike. A 16th century Polish rabbi, Solomon Luria, the Maharshal, called it shameful that some Jews stayed in the inns of non-Jews, drank the forbidden wine, and ate food cooked in non-kosher pots. Some decades later, another Polish rabbi, Benjamin Slonik, conceded that this situation was unavoidable and, for example, allowed the practice of using the utensils of non-Jews to soak meat for salting when, quote, a Jew lodges in the house of a non-Jew and when he does not have kosher utensils. Slonik also made a ruling in a question whether Jews were allowed to lend their clothes to Christians wishing to wear them to church on Christian holidays. In Italy, too, even during the era of the ghetto, Jews, as Stephanie Zygmunt has shown, enjoyed drinking with non-Jews in non-Jewish establishments, even on the Sabbath and festivals. In 1607, for example, the Jewish community leaders of Florence, where the ghetto had been established in 1571, issued a decree, quote, that on the Sabbath and festival days it shall not be permitted for anyone to go to drink and eat at osterie or grecaioli, that is non-Jewish establishments, of any time or type of stripe whatsoever, not to have wine brought in from outside the ghetto on the day of the Sabbath, and that's before delivery.com. But note that the prohibition singled out the Sabbath and holidays. On other days, it seems this has been allowed. Eating, drinking, dancing, and other close contacts led to sexual encounters and even long-term relationships between Jews and Christians. And such sexual relations between Jews and Christians were illegal and caused more than a headache to both Jewish and Christian authorities. Commenting on a passage in the Shulchan Aruch, a Jewish code of law, prohibiting Jews from eating with non-Jews even when they ate their own food, David ben Shmuel Halevi, a 17th century Polish rabbi, stated that the reason for the prohibition was so that there should be no love between us and them. And he continued, harking back to earlier rabbinic opinions, saying that the food of non-Jews were prohibited so that, quote, we should not become close to them on the account of their daughters. But Halevi also admitted that in his times, in many places, one was allowed to enjoy drinks of non-Jews, but only in Jewish space. Thus, despite these prohibitions, such interactions occurred in the early modern era, and those enjoying the delights of the tavern were certainly not, as the Enlightenment-era coffeehouse goers would be called, rebels who defied all authority. Surely they disregarded commandments, defied existing laws, sometimes endangering their lives, and were indeed abandoning themselves to physical pleasure. But this was because this was part of daily life, not a result of free-thinking behavior, as such behavior would be interpreted later in the 18th century and beyond. Yet, the reasons why we learn about the specific cases of Jewish-Christian intimacies also underscores the difference between the modern and pre-modern eras, and the dangers of such daily relations in pre-modern Europe, when the secular and the religious authorities on all sides sought to protect religious and social boundaries. And this was a major function of the law in the pre-modern era. Much of what we know about Jews and Christians and their quotidian lives comes from court records. And that is because certain types of what we would today consider friendly daily interactions were criminalized. Sometimes because even a simple situation, on its own not necessarily criminal, may have turned into a crime. In 1668 in Lublin, a Christian woman and a Jewish man were accused of adultery, a capital offense under the existing law, after they had been caught, apparently, eating a herring and drinking mead locked alone in a room. Both adamantly denied any touching or sexual encounter, and after routine interrogation under torture, they were both dismissed. Law in Poland was strict in seeing sexual relations between Jews and Christians as adultery, thus a crime. But in Italy, and even the Papal States, sexual relations between Jews and Christians sometimes baffled the church authorities and repeatedly raised serious questions about law, jurisdiction, and appropriate punishment. Such cases can be found in the archives of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. And these cases reveal not only Jewish-Christian interactions, but also the inner workings of the Holy Office as it wrestled with difficult cases, which in Poland would have ended up in a summary execution. One such case from 18th century Piacenza puzzled the Holy Office. Two Jewish brothers, Daniele and Angelo Vigevani, ages 34 and 26 respectively, were arrested for having sexual relations with several Christian women in surrounding towns and villages over many years. The behavior was particularly scandalous because they did not frequent only disreputable Christian women, but also women of good repute in different times and places. The Holy Office of Piacenza, and then in Rome, where the case was transferred, was baffled, for it was not clear whether it had jurisdiction over cases of sexual relations between Jews and Christians. Some earlier precedents made it clear that such cases did not belong to the purview of the Holy Office. Sex on account of lust was a crime that belonged to an ordinary court. Only if sexual relations between Jews and Christians could be proven to have been committed in contempt of faith, or if the charges involved continuous cohabitation, did such cases belong to the Holy Office. It remained to be determined how the brothers' actions fit in the frameworks of existing laws and precedents, and the case continued on and on for months. The church law was clear about socializing, the Holy Office argued, but except for 1267 Council of Wien, none of the decrees explicitly address sexual relations between Jews and Christians and penalty for committing them. The Holy Office considered canon law, papal decrees, papal bulls to determine how the case should be treated, both in terms of finding a proper jurisdiction and in terms of determining proper punishment. They also examined precedents of cases of sexual relations between Jews and Christians previously considered by the Holy Office. The case of the Vigevani brothers and many others demonstrate social integration of Jews, perhaps even more intense than in the modern period, when contemporary notions of privacy prevent people from coming and going at will into other people's homes. These cases can serve as illustrations of the position of Jews as at once distinct and integrated into the society in which they lived. They also illustrate that traditional society, Jewish or Christians, did not have strict sexual mores, as it has often been projected by modern historians. The case of the Vigevani brothers from Piacenza also challenges the notion of the church as doctrinaire and cruel in using the Inquisition to prosecute Jews and heretics. Instead, what emerges is an institution somewhat confused and disjointed, wanting to operate more within a legal rather than dogmatic framework. An example of, and as ample evidence from the pre-modern period suggests, close relations between Jews and Christians, friendships, and economic and political integration did not come about only with modernity. But the significance of understanding pre-modern Jewish life and Jewish-Christian daily interactions lies not just in demonstrating that these interactions did take place, but rather in reminding us about the impact political and legal transformation of states in the modern period have had not only on European society, but on our very understanding of both modern and pre-modern history. The criminalization of close Jewish-Christian relations, the dominance of religious writings, the legally structured Jewish autonomy were too often read to indicate pre-modern insularity and segregation. But medieval and early modern Jewish history, seen in its proper historical context, reveals multiple layers of interactions between Jews and non-Jews and a level of Jewish integration into non-Jewish societies in the pre-modern period. There's no doubt that modern and pre-modern periods are different. Indeed, in our times, close interactions between Jews and non-Jews are not against the law. But integration as such can no longer be seen as a basic criterion of the modern period. It is clear now that the traditional narrative of Jewish insularity, victimhood, idealized piety that was only to be shattered by modernity no longer holds. It may be that our notions of pre-modern histories have been influenced by our concepts of modernity too deeply. Perhaps it is the modern era that is in fact the era of true religious autonomy, Jewish or non-Jewish, where the states do not intervene in religious affairs such as community organization or the appointments of rabbis or bishops for that matter, and of social boundaries, where individual ethnic and religious identities are cherished and nurtured, though not imposed by law. Just as the study of daily life and popular culture in broader European historiography undermined preconceptions about religious boundaries and culture among European Christians, so too the study of Jewish societies in its fullest historical context may help us refine not only our understanding of pre-modern history, Jewish or non-Jewish, but also of our understanding of modernity itself. Thank you. If anybody would like to ask questions, David.
Thank you. One of the things that I keep thinking of when I hear this very fine talk, and your very persuasive argument about integration in the pre-modern period, is that there is still a very large elephant sitting in the room, and that is, despite this integration, despite the bleeding over of cultures and societies, Jews were open as a community, or vulnerable as a community constantly to pogrom and to persecution. And when I think of it, when I was listening to your talk, I was thinking of the pogrom in Regensburg in 1519, which leads to the expulsion of the Jews, the the raising of the synagogue and raising a Marian church on top of it.
Yeah.
And also the explicit argument that is made there frequently is about the economic power of the Jews, which to some degree seems to complicate your suggestion that in Germany and the Empire, Jews were seen as socially inferior or economically inferior in contrast to Poland. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Right. So your question is quite complicated. It raises a number of interesting issues here, and one is that yes, Jews were absolutely vulnerable, and I've written my books about it. I wanted to move into a different direction with this talk because I think Jewish history can teach us not only about the mechanisms of violence and prejudice, but also the levels of how societies can get along despite rhetoric, despite animosity. And in terms of that, I would say that these while Jews, again, were, and again, everybody knew, people knew who was Jewish, who was Christian, just by the fact what holidays you were observing, even if you wore the same clothes and you spoke the same language. But what happens is it's the moments of crisis, the moments of tensions that these religious prejudices get triggered. So you have, decades, centuries, people can get along really wonderfully. And, I was teaching in my Eastern European Jewish history seminar a privilege that is one of the most generous privileges that was given to the Jewish community. Actually, it was not single to the Jewish community of the town of Yampol in 1711. Where Jews were sharing, business responsibilities, the city responsibilities. They were even on city council of the town. And then in 1753, they were accused of ritual murder in one of the most horrific trials of the 18th century Poland. And then again, so you have that, and that base of what we've been talking about this past week in the McGinnon lectures, the underlying centuries of religious rhetoric that really meant to otherize Jews and separate them from Christians and demonize them was activated in those moments when whether it was political or whether it was economic, and it often was an economic structure. And I have really interesting examples of trials. There's one trial that was a woman whose child was found dead in a river, and then the local people are trying to make her implicate Jews and say Jews did it. And she said, no, I'd rather tell it on my father, that my father did it, than I would tell on Jews, because they didn't do it. And the local burghers feel like, yeah, Jews are competition. If we only could use it to expel them, that would be. So there's clearly an underlying economic tension. The same was in the case of Przemysl from 1630 that I briefly cited. In terms of Germany, I oversimplified it because I was referring to the German Jewish historiography more. That again, what the book that recently came on Strasbourg, and there is some other fascinating work being done on Germany has been done, obviously has complicated that story. But still, they were, except for the very high-profile figures, I think the average average Jew in Poland was in a much higher economic and social position than in Germany. And for one thing, you didn't have ghettos in Poland. They were, not implemented. They were implemented in places in Germany and such. Yes.
Could you speak about the role of Jewish women in your historiography? You're mentioning pretty much predominantly all men.
Yes. Well, the history of Jewish women is just a sort of a relatively young field. There's scholarship that's emerging on it. A few scholars who have published recently books on especially medieval Europe, and now some scholars are working on the early modern period. We see them certainly in sources as active agents. They are participating in economic life. They are active members of the community. Definitely, but you're right. The sources are predominantly male sources. Yeah. And the questions that lead people into courts are generally related. If it's sexual relations, it's about men and Christian women. Yes, David.
I'm a modern historian, so I'm going to gloss over this modern period. You suggest that essentially this vision of isolated Jews is an invention of the 19th century. And towards the end of the talk, you suggested that in effect it might be an outcome of the liberal state, the idea that religious communities are autonomous and are not integrated into the state. I wonder if it'd be better to look at it, and I'm basing this on very little knowledge, so feel free to knock me down. This is also, of course, the period of assimilation. And at the very beginning of that, we have the guy whose name I've forgotten, who wrote On the Civic Improvement of the Jews, where essentially he suggests that through integration you can annihilate culturally Jews, that they will stop being Jews. I wonder if this invention of exclusion in the past might be a way of commenting on that particular project. For German Jews, for example, it's a way of saying, hey, look how far we've come. We don't have to disappear. We've integrated. Reform Judaism is as far as we need to go. Whereas perhaps German nationalists might also be using the same kind of image to say, what are you talking about assimilation? They've never been similar. They've never been part of us. And consequently, assimilation is impossible. So I can't help but wonder if this invention of an exclusionary past is actually a way of saying assimilation is never going to work.
Well, I think the problem with that is exactly, again, it's the rhetoric of assimilation is part of that story. But I think the larger question is, and with the dissolution of the Jewish autonomy and community and all that, is related to the transformation of the states. And that is something, I mean, Jews were, you had to be Jewish unless you converted, because it was a legal category as much as it was a cultural religious category. So you could be very much integrated into the pre-modern society. You could have spoken the same language, worn the same clothes, as the response by Benjamin Slonik clearly shows that Christians were wearing the same clothes because Christians were borrowing them to go to church. So, but it was clear, it was legally clear that who was who, that you, in order to belong, pay taxes, whatever, you needed to belong to a community. So, so that there was more room for that kind of integration, I would argue. In the modern period, you have, again, the anxiety over assimilation and integration, which is why I said my argument about integration should not be mistaken and should not be taken for my argument about assimilation. That's something entirely different. And again, it goes back to the German project, right? What you were saying, this idea of again, are Jews going to? This goes back to the discussion of citizenship. Are Jews going to be good citizens? Can they be good citizens? Can they be good French citizens or German citizens in this? And again, Germany becomes this problematic case in response to the French case in the modern period. So I don't know whether I am addressing what you've asked or push me.
I wasn't actually asking so much about whether or not they were integrated. Again, from the basis of my knowledge, you sound incredibly persuasive on that. It's more, I'm interested in why you would invent this myth that Jews were entirely separate.
Oh, okay, because it came on from the cultural milieu of the Jews who were educated and who were not connected or didn't feel connected with those Jews who were more traditional. So they were perceiving them as this sort of other, and they really, orientalized them. As I said, they needed to westernize, they needed to Europeanize in that way. So that's where it came out. This intellectual milieu, and it came again at the same time as Ranke is writing his history of the Germanic people, and Jews are writing the same. They, their own methods of addressing Jewish history in the same way. So as part of the new sort of creation of new identity. So, yeah.
So setting aside the true promised land of the Jews is the Bronx.
No, it's Poland.
This is what my mother told me. Where in the early modern period, if you're going to be Jewish, do you think you ought to be, if you're going to sort of maximize your opportunities and live with the least amount of anxiety? If that's not a contradiction in terms as we're talking about Jews.
Probably that's a contradiction in terms, but there are a number of places you could sort of establish, a decent life that doesn't mean that it would be totally secure and forever and ever. But certainly you would have the Ottoman Empire, you would have Poland, and the Italian peninsula as well. Certainly, I mean, then once Amsterdam and Holland opens up, the Dutch Republic and England, then you add that area as well. So, and again, depends on your social status and how much money you have too. So that's
Something's never changed.
some things never change. But there was certainly much less of this control in Poland, and that's what we see. Certainly, the papal nuncios government's like, oh, you can't believe what's going on with Jews here. You can't, implement anything about Jews what we would like to. So those restrictions were, and then the Ottoman Empire is just a different. Okay.
Magda, maybe one more.
Okay, one more question.
If it's there.
If this. All right.
If not,
Thank you so much.
Dr. Teter, thank you so much for your inaugural Shvidler lecture. I'd like to thank Rabbi Sklerin for your prayer, Mr. Matlin for your remarks, and let us thank Eugene Shvidler through his son Daniel one more time. Thank you very much. Before I close, Father McShane asked if I could acknowledge one very special person who's with us this evening. And with us here is Miss Judy Altman. And Miss Altman is the grandmother of a current student and who's just photographing Miss Altman. So thank you so much for being with us this evening. There is a reception awaiting us behind you. Thank you so much